Thank you so much. Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Elfreth. I have the great privilege of representing District 30 in the Maryland State Senate and serving as co-chair on the Joint Committee for Program Open Space and Agricultural Land Preservation, joined by my esteemed colleague, Delegate Robin Lewis, who's going to speak in just a moment. I want to thank everybody for making the time in the interim. This is our second meeting of the Joint Committee. The first meeting we had just a month ago to give the new members of the committee and everyone, frankly, a refresher on the two major programs that we are here to discuss. We garnered some great ideas and feedback on what we could speak to at the second hearing of the interim before session, and today's agenda really reflects that, and with an added bonus of inviting members of the public to give their thoughts and creative ideas to the questions that we are dealing with here. So I'll briefly go over the agenda and then kick it over to my partner in this, Delegate Robin Lewis. So we are going to first accept that public testimony, and then we are moving on to a presentation from the Chesapeake Bay land change on the Chesapeake Bay land change model. And then we've invited back our friends at Department of Natural Resources, Department of Agriculture, and Department of Planning to give us a follow-up on some of the ideas and questions we had posed in the last meeting. Then we've left some time at the end for discussion amongst the legislators, because this is currently planned to be the last meeting of the Joint Committee this interim. And so we want to just see what folks are thinking, walk through legislative or budget concepts before we reconvene in January. And then we'll have a close and see all of you well before January again. But in the meantime, I'm excited for today's agenda. Delegate Lewis.
Thank you so much, Senator Elfreth. And again, let me extend my welcome and gratitude to everyone who's joined us here today for the second interim meeting of the Joint Subcommittee on Program Open Space. The senators already walked us through the agenda. Let me just flag one idea for you. Let's think about this subcommittee as a catalyst for legislative and programmatic action. We have the power to really get some things done with an amazing array of agency, staff, experts, with a community of advocates and members of the public with wonderful ideas. So let's consider this our kickoff for the next phase of great work we'll do to preserve, protect, and beautify our wonderful state. With that, I will introduce our first speaker, Diana Conway, who serves as president of Safe and Healthy Playing Fields Incorporated, to talk about program open space local funding for use in artificial turfs. Ms. Conway.
Great. Thank you very much, Delegate Lewis. Good afternoon, Chair Elfreth, Chair Lewis, and honorable members of the subcommittee. Thanks for this opportunity to testify and to request that you discontinue any POS funding for artificial turf fields. My name is Diana Conway from Montgomery County, and I'm president, as she said, of the 501c3 Safe Healthy Playing Fields. We work to inform communities and policymakers on why artificial turf fields are a 5-time loser on every aspect of sports fields. The 5 are heat, toxicity, plastic waste disposal, cost, and injuries. My remarks today will focus on the first 3, heat, toxicity, and the plastic waste. Program Open Space is really a gift to the future, and we contend that when it comes to sports fields, the highest best use of POS funds is for the installation and maintenance of natural grass fields. These funds should not be going to plastic fields that get dangerously hot, that are made of non-renewable, non-sustainable petroleum products, and that are loaded with an ever-changing brew of toxic chemicals, and each of which ends up in an unwanted, unrecyclable, multi-hundred-ton mountain of mixed plastic waste. Now we also know that each artificial turf field contains PFAS, this per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and in some cases has been found to contain up to 38 pounds per individual field. So let me get into some detail. The first is heat. This one's simple. Artificial turf is uncontestably hot and soars in our area to 150 and even 160s. You may remember Jordan McNair in 2018 collapsed and later died in May of 2018 from exertional heat stroke on an artificial turf field. With climate change, these fields will become unusable and literally lethal for a growing number of hours on a growing number of days. An unusably hot field is not a community resource. It's a massive heat island that's off-gassing methane and ethylene and leaching its toxicity. In contrast, a grass field extends a cooling effect while sequestering carbon, supplying eco-services, infiltrating water, rainwater, and more. The second item is toxicity. There is a stubborn public perception that any product on the market must be safe. But artificial turf's known toxicity load is staggering, and the revelations keep coming. Top of the list, as I said, is PFAS, and the industry has now acknowledged before the California State Legislature that every single plastic carpet, regardless of brand or vintage or infill, contains PFAS because they cannot manufacture it without the PFAS. It is tied to reduced vaccine efficacy, low birth weight, liver disease, kidney, testicular, and breast cancer, including shocking rates of disease and death among firefighters whose turnout gear and firefighting foam are loaded with PFAS. Is this what we want communities exposed to for soccer games? Is it the right use for POS funds? On one hand, the EPA set a cap of 4 parts per trillion for drinking water. On the other, a Swedish study found 38 pounds of PFAS in some of the fields they tested, but PFAS in all of them. What's more, published research now proves that PFAS producers knew as early as the 70s that it was, quote, highly toxic when inhaled and moderately toxic when ingested. Athletes inhale. We should not be using PFAS funds for such a product. They also contain heavy metals, endocrine disruptors, and carcinogen and more, especially the fields that use shredded waste tire. 40,000 shredded waste tires per field, with a loss rate, according to industry training materials, of 1 to 5 tons per field per year. That is surely a violation of the Clean Water Act, and it is an expense as well as a liability issue for the state. The third issue is plastic, microplastics, and disposal. Artificial turf releases plastic and microplastic from its first day as a field and over the hundreds of years it takes to decompose, and that goes everywhere. A Spanish study found marine microplastic was up to 15% of artificial turf blades in the plastic debris they collected in coastal waters and rivers, with similar findings in Tokyo and mainland China. Likewise, for the infill, hundreds of tons of finely ground, highly mobile bits that disperse in rain, wind, with field grooming, and of course, with use. You should know that there is no true recycling of artificial turf fields in the US, none. There's some great video in the footnotes of my written comments of some of your colleagues like Delegates Love, Lafferty, and Resnick getting into it with artificial turf reps who finally had to acknowledge there are no disposal standards and no recycling in the US. Old fields are bulky and heavy. They weigh 400 tons each. And so the result is many who are getting rid of their fields choose not to dispose of them legally, but have them hauled, quote, away, like the Richard Murray field that was hauled to the side of Bird River in 2018 from Montgomery County Public Schools. Between 1,000 and 2,000 fields are coming out every year across the US. At 400 tons each, that hauling and that disposal are an unresolved challenge. But POS can be part of the solution, and we need to think about a hard stop on all non-essential use of PFAS and plastics and climate-changing materials. Compared to vital medical or military use, are sports fields really essential? There is a well-known and proven alternative that's commercially available, turfgrass fields. We can do this, and I hope you will take the lead in staking out Maryland's role here. Program Open Space is a profoundly hopeful, visionary undertaking, and I hope you will consider how your program and your funding fits into the coherence of Maryland's sustainability strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Conway. It was good to see you and appreciate your advocacy on this issue. And we know that's years long. Thank you.
Thanks.
I was remiss, I did not introduce the members of the Joint Committee who are here today, and really appreciate your time, particularly in the interim. So I saw Senator Jason Gallion, thank you very much, and Senator Cheryl Kagan. Delegate, I'm not sure if you want to introduce the delegates on the call as well.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I'd like to welcome Delegate Ann Healy, Delegate Dana Stein, And I think that's all I'm seeing right now.
I think we're
If
tied.
I've, yeah, if I've missed anyone, please know you are welcome and appreciated.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to continue with our public testimony and happy to welcome Charlotte Davis from the Rural Maryland Council to give us her perspective. Ms. Davis.
Good afternoon, Madam Chairs, members of the committee. I'm Charlotte Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Rural Maryland Council. We are an independent state agency located in the Maryland Department of Agriculture. I did have slides. I don't know if Andrew, are you showing them or can I share my screen? Okay, thank you. Mainly I'm here as also as a co-chair of Partners for Open Space. We are a statewide coalition that comes together to strongly support program Open Space and the funding formula that supports it. Next slide. I'm going to do the dreaded next slide. So, mainly our support comes out of economic development. Most of the programs are related to rural economic development and placemaking. They're incredibly important for our ag land and our next generation of farmers. And then I did want to just cover equity. Access to water is a big concern for us, and then stewardship, maintaining our existing properties. Next slide. The parts related to heritage areas and our state parks are important tourism drivers for our rural areas. Assateague Island, Assateague and Deep Creek are huge drivers. We have the new National Heritage Area in Southern Maryland that should be coming online soon and welcoming visitors to Southern Maryland. And that visitor spending is hugely important for rural communities. The Department of Commerce released a study late last year to show that economic impact. So $16.4 billion of total economic impact of $26.4 billion overall in indirect and induced impacts. So, supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs and generating local tax revenues throughout the state. Next slide. Oops, wrong way. And then, it also the MALF program and just resource-based industries throughout the state. It's just incredibly important to have access to that land. Over, half of the land is privately owned. It's working lands, and it's incredibly important to our heritage and our, like I said, the tourism and overall quality of life. It underpins most of our rural economies in the Western Maryland, Eastern Shore, and Southern Maryland. Next slide. But we do have challenges coming in the agriculture industry. It's mainly that aging workforce. The average age of a farmer is climbing. And then that loss of working land. We're seeing a lot of competition for the same land, particularly related to renewable energy, affordable housing. We've got a lot of needs. So there's a lot of pressure to develop that land. And we want to make sure that there's that's available for our next generation so that we can be producing food, fiber, and fuel for the rest of the state. I'm going to quote the often phrase, I know this, you hear this a lot, but the best ag land preservation is a profitable farm. We strongly believe in that, making our farms profitable, but one of those challenges is that access to land. Next slide. And I just included these mainly for information. I think you probably got this information from the Department of Agriculture, just to remind everybody how important, how many farms. You can go to the next slide. I think I've got some more demographic data in there, how we're seeing that average size and those trends of increasing the number of farms, increasing the number of acres in farmland. Next slide. But I did want to talk a little bit about the Next Generation Farmland Acquisition Program. It did receive funding under the Great Maryland Outdoors Act. Everybody is familiar with MARBICO, the Maryland Agricultural Resource-Based Industry Development Corporation. Everybody knows it as MARBICO, and they are helping young and beginning farmers access that land. And they did receive funding through the Great Maryland Outdoors Act for that. If you go to the next slide. they're launching a new program, specifically more important in an urban setting, and that's that small acreage next generation farmland acquisition program. And that's to help young farmers purchase 10 to 49 acre farms. So for those programs that, look for 100 acres or more, this MARBIDCO program will be able to help those farmers looking at smaller acreages. Next slide. And so overall, I think you all can be proud of the results that MARBIDCO has done, 44 projects since the beginning of the program in 2018, and then a total acreage of 4,000 protected. Next slide. And so I just want to touch on access to water. I included the map of the equity tool that shows the state, and that a lot of rural areas lack access to recreational amenities and particularly water. Majority of Maryland's shoreline is privately owned. I tried to find a number. It's anywhere between 85% to 96% is privately owned. So oftentimes we'll find rural residents that live a half a mile from water, but cannot get to it because of that private ownership. And then for recreational amenities, we often live in areas that have no transit and are far from things like playing fields, taking students and youth to rec leagues. That is often a challenge in rural areas. Next slide. And then, the idea that we've preserved about 30% of our land already, which is great, and we need to do more. But we want to make sure that we're maintaining those properties, particularly our forest lands, and that we believe that our land trust community can be very helpful in this and making sure that we can use these conservation easements that help us conserve open space, that farmland and those wood areas. And so we're looking for ways to help support them in what they do, so that we're making sure that our lands are being stewarded and are being protected at the same time. So finally, my last slide is just we are here in support of full cash funding of all the sector. We support all of the sectors of the program, from state side, local side, heritage areas to MALF, rural legacy. We support the current allocation of the funding, and that formula, and that, overall it helps us support our rural economy and our rural communities. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present today, and appreciate all the work you all are doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Davis. Next, we'll go to another member of the Partner for Open Space Coalition, Mr. Owen Bailey, if you would.
You don't have to see the presentation. I'm happy just to speak to everyone. But good afternoon, members of the committee. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to speak before you. My name is Owen Bailey. I'm the Director of Land Use and Policy with the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy, as well as co-chair, along with Charlotte, of Partners for Open Space. Partners is an organization that really operates on 3 pillars of advocacy: equitable access to open space, continued consistent funding and implementation of program open space, and strong and successful land trust partnerships. Why? Because we see tremendous value that program open space brings to the state of Maryland through the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation, helping to protect our most valuable and productive farmland; the Rural Legacy Program that helps to preserve contiguous tracts of land to enhance natural resources, agriculture, forestry, and environmental protection; local side POS that helps support and enhance our county park service; and stateside POS that helps to support our state park service, as well as provide additional funds to our counties for land acquisition to create more parks. Together, these programs create what we see as one beautiful balance of sustainable land use. Now, to provide a little bit of context, Partners was created really out of a need, and that need came from continuous diversion of funds from POS into the general operating fund. Over a 20-year period, about $1.4 billion was taken from POS and put into the general operating fund. But thanks to the members that make up Partners for Open Space, as well as others as well as delegates and senators, were able to successfully stop that practice of diverting funds to the general operating budget and to negotiate repayment of approximately $800 million back into the program. And thanks to the efforts done to pass the Great Maryland Outdoors Act, full repayment of that will be completed in the next in FY24 and FY25. So you see those numbers reflected in the budget. The booming real estate market that we've seen in the last few years has helped fuel program open space. The transfer tax revenues that have come in have been amazing to see. But even at full funding, even with the addition of the increased real estate market, the program has sort of been stunted because of lack of staff capacity within DNR and other departments. The program has been fully funded. It has not been fully implemented. But we've seen that corrected under new leadership. And as Secretary Kurtz reported in the last meeting, the DNR capacity is back up and they have a project pipeline full and ready for implementation. That historic real estate market has sort of has cut both ways. Though it has put more funds into the program, it has also made land acquisition more difficult because of the higher land value cost. So we do see that coming down. So in the next couple of years, we see an opportunity for full funding and implementation of this program through full funding, staffing, and lower land costs. And today the program is thriving thanks to the great staff at DNR, strong public-private partnership with the state and land trusts that have been developed over the last couple of years, and that other members of Partners for Open Space can attest. We've also seen huge demand for the various programs that make up Program Open Space. As Secretary Kurtz and his staff mentioned at the last meeting, the number of easement applications they receive annually far outweigh the available funds for purchased easements. The land preservation parks and recreation plans that all counties updated last year show a need for $2 billion in acquisition and updates for our parks throughout the state. And we should not forget the stress that the pandemic put on our parks and the fragility that it showed. And that demand is not going away. We're equally thrilled by programs like Green Space Equity Bill that passed last year that will help us meet the demand for parks in places where it is needed most. And the Maryland the Beautiful Acts will help us has set achievable goals that will create sustainability in a changing climate. Less funding of the program going forward as real estate market slows will mean that there are fewer funds in the program. And as we see the repayments come to a close, we will see the annual budgets for POS come down from sort of an artificial place to where we can expect them to be in the coming years. More on the Maryland Beautiful Act. It sets a goal of preserving 30% by 2030 and 40% by 2040. And we are very close to achieving that 30% by 2030. And that is partially in thanks to the success of this program and the success of our public-private partnerships. So the POS is essential if we have any hope of obtaining our 40 by 40 goal. It will not be enough to meet 40 by 40, but it will get us most of the way there. So we need to sustain the funding for the programs and sustain support for our public-private partnerships and the infrastructure for the pipeline of projects through this well-established network. Personally, I'm really excited through the Maryland the Beautiful Act that the Smart Growth Subcabinet has been tasked with coordinating the various departments from the state to achieve these goals. I'm looking forward to the report that should come out sometime next summer. So in closing, there are well-established benefits and value brought to our communities because of Program Open Space. Need to protect our productive farmland in a changing climate that is threatened through sea level rise, saltwater intrusion. The need to protect contiguous tracts of land, whether it be farms, forests, and other habitat, becomes a force multiplier when you cluster these conservation projects in our hubs and corridors. The need to meet increased demand for state and local parks to make them more accessible. They provide such a strong, substantial economic benefit for outdoor recreation and tourism and provide huge public health benefits, both mental and physical health, as people look to get outside in an increasingly online world. And the benefits from program open space continue to grow and are now more important than ever. And so we ask for your help in protecting this program. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Truly appreciate you being here and your perspective. Next, we're going to welcome, we didn't do this on purpose, but I just happened to be able to introduce her, Jessica Lays, who's our local director of Recreation and Parks in Anne Arundel County, and is here wearing two hats. She's also representing the Maryland Association of County Park and Recreation Administrators. Director Lays, thank you for being here.
Awesome. Thank you, Ms. Owens. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to come today to speak on behalf of our Maryland Association of County Parks and Recreation Administrators. As Sarah said, I'm Jessica Lays, the director of Anne Arundel County, and I'm really hoping today to not only be here in support of local open space funding, but also just to bring the local jurisdiction's perspective and focus on the importance of the partnership with the state in order to meet the demands and the needs of our state residents. So the first thing I kind of wanted to talk about is just the power of POS funding, specifically the local side POS, and having that dedicated funding source that allows our rec and parks in different jurisdictions to consistently acquire and develop park space across the state of Maryland. And I think that's really important for this group to understand because it promotes equity in our investments, specifically by eliminating the size of our jurisdictions as well as our tax bases that sometimes create bias in decision making. Because this is not a competitive grant, it's a formula-driven grant, it allows us to invest those funds in a very systematic way, in a very equality or equitable way throughout our counties. Local program open space facilitates access for all. And that's an important requirement of POS to keep the open space or to keep the space open to the public and provide safe spaces for Maryland residents to come out and enjoy. To illustrate the history and importance of program open space, I'd like to share this small video clip that was created post-COVID to kind of tell the story of the importance and the history of local open space. So, Andrew, I think you just had it up for us. Thank you.
Maryland has a legacy of preserving our natural areas, waterways, and wildlife through program open space. Through the support of program open space, Maryland has protected over 394,000 acres of land that's an economic driver, that's crucial to mental and physical health of Marylanders. It contributes to climate resiliency and the overall quality of life of our state. With continued development and more people using the public areas during the COVID-19 pandemic, we're relying on you to fund this crucial program more than ever. Thank you for continuing this 50-year legacy for the generations to come.
Thank you. So there's a longer version. It's a little bit more comprehensive that dives into some of the details of what program open space investment return for the residents of the state of Maryland. I'm happy to share that link with you as well. And while this video might be a little bit dated as far as statistical, nothing's really changed. In fact, COVID-19 really highlighted and validated the importance of our park system to our residents. Those benefits are enabled by the state partnership on local program open space funding. As Mr. Bailey had highlighted, A lot of that is defined through our Land Preservation Parks and Recreation Plan, which I much rather call the LIPRA or the LPPIP, where we identify our needs based on proximity and demand. Every county does it the same way. And that is the value of this process, is that we all look at our supply and our inventory. We all look at us in comparison to national standards, our growth of population, our age demographics. We look at our participation numbers and our visitation numbers in order to kind of decide what is it that we need in each geographical area. But the most important component is the public outreach and talking to the residents that live in the state about the things that they would like to see in their park system. That then becomes a data-driven decision-making process that looks at the proximity of your parks, looks at the equity of our park system in order to meet those needs, not just because it's nice to have, but because it's needed in that area, or that there is an inequitable allocation of that resource across the state. And I think that's the value, because the demand definitely outweighs the resources right now. As Mr. Bailey said, there's a $2 billion identified in the 2022 LPPIPs. Every county has demands that exceed the amount of revenues they have. And what the local POS money does is it allows us to make smart decisions based on the data. That then brings more diversity into our parks and recreational amenities. The parks are easily, guided through a ton of demands, a ton of things are wanted. What do we decide what we want to do? In 2022 at the Mako conference, we ran a session that was called Not a Walk in the Park. And we specifically talked about the importance of financial resources in order to continue to invest in recreation and parks. And we showed the successes. We showed lots of pictures of things like natural preservation and conservation of natural space, trails, water access points, various sizes and shapes of parks, athletic amenities, playgrounds, recreational facilities, things like pickleball and tennis, that showed how we can use the local POS money to help the counties continue to make environmentally sustainable investments and accessible investments. And a perfect example is right here in Anne Arundel County, where without the state's money, we would not have been able to come in and put the rubber cork surfaces down on our playgrounds because it was simply too expensive and we didn't have the resources to do that. So we leveraged the state funding to make every one of our playgrounds more accessible for use by county residents. The local program open space money is also a very reliable tool to keep up with those record high visitations that we're all experiencing. Our parks, our natural areas, and our water access point has seen 150% increase in measurable park use statewide. A lot of us thought that was just a trend during COVID and that everyone would go back to work and back to school and people would stop coming out in such large numbers. But what ended up happening was the opposite. It became part of people's daily routines to come out to their park space and use the amenity more often. Local program open space money helps us meet that demand. The state has given over 6,900 open space grants and protected 50,000 acres of land in the state of Maryland. That's quite an amazing statistic. That is public benefit from the power of local program open space. So I'm here today really as a partner that local jurisdictions not only rely on this money, but we appreciate the partnership. We appreciate the conversations. We really appreciate the subcommittee coming together ahead of time to talk about the important allocation of this money. And we continue to work side by side with you to make Rec and Parks the best place for everyone in the state of Maryland.
Thank you very much. I'm inspired to spend more program open space money immediately. Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Lays. Next, we welcome Joel Dunn, who is President and CEO of the Chesapeake Conservancy. Mr. Dunn.
Thank you so much, Chairwoman Lewis and Chairwoman Elfreth. Thank you so much for having me and for the opportunity to provide testimony today. I did want to say that my friends Owen, Charlotte, and Jessica are all conservation heroes, and I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to hear their opinions today, because they're really on the ground making these conservation projects happen. So I'm a Maryland resident. I'm also the president of the Chesapeake Conservancy. I also co-convene a watershed-wide coalition of conservation organizations called the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership. And we're aiming to try and protect 30% of the Chesapeake Bay watershed by 2030. You may have seen a significant press release from the EPA Chesapeake Bay program highlighting that over 9.1 million acres have been protected in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but that we have over 3 million to go to get to 30%. So we have a long way to go watershed wide. I've been a member of the steering committee of the Partners for Open Space since 2010. And having been the chairman or the vice chairman of that group for many years during that time, I really appreciate the work they do. I actually handed that role to Josh Kurtz at one point in his prior life, and then took it back when he went to join CBF. So while that role has rarely, if ever, generated much attention for me personally, it has been one of the most important that I think I've fulfilled in my conservation career, which now spans more than 2 decades. Program Open Space was enacted with one simple but compelling and enduring goal, which was simply, as an acre of land is converted to development, an acre of land is conserved as open space. And there's been periods where this goal has been achieved, but the goal should still be our North Star. And it's very simple, using that revenue from 0.5% of state transfer tax. We're doing this work, and that revenue rises or declines according to the market. And from its inception, that revenue was divided 50-50 between the Department of Natural Resources and our county governments, including Baltimore City. Initially, DNR could use its share only to acquire land for parks, forest, wildlife management areas, and natural resource areas. Improvements to these lands for public access was also allowed, and uses were provided through the state's capital budget for that. But local governments could use their grants for land acquisition and a percentage for improving lands. Over the past 5 decades or so, POS has proven to be relevant as related to the needs that we have as a society. And the uses have broadened to things like the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation, and many other programs have been derived since then, pulling on DNR's share of program open space. I wanted to review a couple of these demands just to make sure everybody's familiar with them. So I want to start by saying the baseline for DNR's acquisitions of lands by fee or easement is the Greenprint program, which identifies targeted ecological areas or hubs of forest or wetlands that preserve species or water quality. There's other priorities too, like water access and historic improvements. But the other demands on POS are, $7.5 million for heritage areas authorities, $6 million in general obligation bonds from 2009 that won't be retired until 2026, $8 million for rural legacy, $10 million direct to Baltimore City, a new green space equity program, which, as many of you know, I've been a big supporter of up to $5 million in 2025 and additional monies after that, as well as the Maryland Great Outdoors Act, which I've also been a big supporter of, with specific parks like Maryland Freedom Park or Port Deposit or Elktonia. So there are a lot of demands on the DNR's share of program open space. I love that the Maryland the Beautiful Act establishes some really grand goals for conservation, 30% of our lands by 2030, which I know your previous session, you determined that we're almost there, and I'm grateful for that. But 40% by 2040, that's a big goal. It also authorizes funding for a land trust revolving loan fund and other land trust capacity building and stewardship activities. And I wanted to note and express my gratitude to the Department of Natural Resources for their recent efforts to really leverage and build partnerships with land trusts and expand their work with county governments like Jessica's to accomplish our collective goals. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the demands for program open space funds will continue to grow, especially with our population growth and bringing with it the continued demand for more accessible open space, preserving biodiversity, acquiring easements for wetlands and areas for our waters to rise or due to climate change, and other challenges we haven't even, foreseen yet. So I urge the members of this joint subcommittee to support continued full funding for program open space and oversee the successful implementation of all program open space funded programs. And I urge you to maintain your support for the current program open space formula. And I really appreciate your consideration of my comments today.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn. Really appreciate your perspective and all the work the partnership does on behalf of the issues we're talking about today. Next, we have a special presentation followed by a brief discussion of the group from on the Chesapeake Bay land change model from Mr. Peter Claggett, who is a research geographer with the U.S. Geological Survey. Mr. Claggett, welcome.
Thank you, Senator Elfreth, and thank you, Delegate Lewis. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully this will work right. Can you guys see this slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Peter Claggett. I'm a research geographer with the U.S. Geological Survey at the Chesapeake Bay Program Office, and I'm going to be talking about something that we published recently in the last several months, which is our Chesapeake Bay land change model. It's been in development and used by the Chesapeake Bay program over the last decade. And in our paper, what we did is we simulated future development in Maryland through different scenarios of the future and looked at the impact of those different scenarios on water quality in the Bay. Our model is driven by population projections. And what I'm showing here is kind of the recent population projections, the most recent across all states. And the colored map on the right-hand side shows the darker brown areas where we have higher expected population growth from 2022 to 2050. And where we have blue, it's either population decline or no increase in population is expected over this period. And you can see that all the Maryland counties are not blue, expecting some degree of growth. And Maryland as a state, the portion in the Bay watershed is expecting about a 20% increase in population over this almost 30-year period. And that is going to result in some amount of natural land conversion and farmland conversion, which is what our model simulates. So very briefly, the way our land change model works is we take population projections, in this case produced by Maryland Department of Planning and the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, and employment projections also by those two entities. We convert the population projections into a housing demand and the employment projections into a job demand. We look at how much by county, uniquely by county, how much of that growth is going to be accommodated by infill and redevelopment by looking at the infill and redevelopment patterns of the past. And when the population is not accommodated as infill or redevelopment, it then would result in some amount of conversion of farmland or forest land. And that's what's listed here as like the housing demand or employment demand. We simulate this demand for jobs and for housing on the landscape stochastically and iteratively over 101 times to estimate the future residential footprint and commercial footprint. And I'll show you images that hopefully illustrate it better than the way I'm describing it. And that develops a future land cover, land use map, which we overlay on current conditions to assess the change. And then we summarize those change by census tracts, by small watersheds. And that information is then immediately fed into the Chesapeake Bay watershed model to look at the impacts on water quality. We also simulate spatially land conservation. And through a special project with the Chesapeake Conservancy, over this next year, we'll be incorporating machine learning into this model and the simulation of utility scale solar fields. So I mentioned that we produce 101 iterations of the future that are all equally likely. And then we summarize and average the results by small watershed to get a plausible estimate of where growth is going to occur in the future. So this is an example actually from Virginia, down near Lynchburg, where you can see the commercial in kind of fuchsia and residential growth in yellow. This is the degree, the kind of the level of specificity at which we simulate future growth. And then we can also simulate farmland conservation and forest land conservation, which you can see in red and light green kind of across the landscape. We do this again 101 times and then average the results by small watershed. Here's an example of our simulation on Kent Island where I live. And this was kind of funny because I looked at this example and these areas actually have these areas in yellow where we simulated future residential growth are now being developed just by chance as residential areas where they used to be more farmland. But for every tiny little patch of growth that we simulate on the landscape, we know the area, we know whether it's served by sewer or septic systems, we know the average lot size based on the density, and from that we can get how much of the area is impervious, how much of it's going to be turf grass, and what the former land use was, whether it was farmland or forest, and that would be go into our conversion statistics of how much farmland or forest land is lost to development. Our infill data, we validated the entire model in our paper in Maryland using Maryland Property View data. And our infill model worked really well for residential, about an 80% correlation with observed data from Maryland Property View of where infill redevelopment occurred, and about a 55% correlation for commercial development. Our estimated rates of infill and redevelopment for every Maryland county range from 7%, I think it was Garrett County, all the way up to 92%, which was Baltimore City. As I mentioned in the beginning, we simulated multiple scenarios for Maryland. We simulated 5. A historic trends model where we basically just take the trends of the 2000s and extrapolate that into the future. Then we constrained that growth with Maryland generalized zoning data for the state from the Maryland Department of Planning. We then developed a growth management scenario where we increased the levels of infill and redevelopment, we increased the amount of growth on sewer versus septic, and increased the density of future growth. Another scenario was forest conservation, where we aggressively conserved all riparian areas and large tracts of forests. And likewise, for agricultural conservation, we did the same thing, but with agriculture, we looked at where we have prime and very productive farmlands and preserved those from future development. These, the latter 4 scenarios all had actually all these scenarios have the same population projection. They're based on the same population and employment projection. They're just expressing that differently on the landscape based on a variety of constraints. So for all these scenarios, each one of these bars represents a different scenario. And what this shows is the hectares of change and the number of septic systems changed per scenario. So what you can see here, this first set of bars shows you the amount of impervious surface, additional impervious surface that's expected from 2013 to 2025 through all 5 of these scenarios. The higher the bar, the more impervious. So the historic trend, extending the trends of the 2000s would lead to the most impervious surface, the most pervious surface. So that's the second set of bars, and pervious, it's pervious developed. So that would be turf grass, backyard trees, that type of thing. And then when you have the most development, you also have the most conversion, the loss of natural lands, forests and wetlands, the loss of agricultural lands, and the most dispersed growth. And so you're getting the most growth on septic. And we can, quantify all this for the different scenarios. And what you can see here is if you just look at the kind of overall amounts of development, you could also see this in the bar chart, but growth management compared to any other scenario minimizes the amount of future growth and minimizes the amount of conversion of both natural lands and agricultural lands. Using data from the Chesapeake Bay watershed model, we can estimate, this is for Maryland counties, and what these boxes are showing you is the nitrogen and pollution rates in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare for impervious surface here, for like turf grass down here. Construction, new construction has higher loads. And then we have natural land in the middle down towards the bottom. We have open space down here, very low loading, very low polluting land use. Farming is up at the top, but you can see there's a big range across all the counties depending on the type of farming, big range in pollution load. And then septic is over here with its own contribution. And we can tally up by scenario, by county, what the different levels of pollution are. In this case, it's nitrogen. We also did it for phosphorus and sediment for all counties. In some counties, particularly on the eastern shore, where development would take out a lot of farmland, that could actually lead to an overall decrease of nitrogen because development tends to have a lower polluting nitrogen load than farmland. Now that's just for nutrients. I'm not talking about toxics or other things where development would come out as perhaps more damaging. And so we can tally up the loads by scenario. So these are pounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment, or actually, sorry, kilograms, reduced from 2013 to 2025 into these different scenarios. And again, growth management comes out as being the lowest overall polluting land use that you could have. And that includes, just to reiterate, infill and redevelopment, the expansion of sewer service areas, incentivized growth in areas served by sewer, and increasing the density of development. So that would be going from kind of single family homes on large lots to smaller lots to townhomes and condominiums. However, one point I want to make, and I'm not sure they're made in these slides, which is while growth management across these different scenarios is definitely the superior one for minimizing pollution and minimizing the conversion of forest and farmlands, it by itself does not ensure that the most valued farmlands and the most valued natural lands are protected. For that, you need land conservation. And so none of these scenarios really should be looked at kind of on their own without land conservation. You need planning, you need growth management, but you also need land conservation to protect the best of the best. And lastly, we will be redoing these forecasts going all the way out to year 2070 over the summer. And we will be including the simulation of utility scale solar fields. We're going to incorporate high resolution land use data, which some of you may be aware of. We've mapped all of Maryland at 1 meter resolution for 2014 and 2018 in partnership with the Chesapeake Conservancy and University of Vermont. And we will update that with 2021 data this summer. That's going to inform these models. We're going to be using the parcel data from Maryland and using machine learning, all to improve the accuracy of our forecasts. And the citation for the paper I've been mentioning is here at the bottom. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm absorbing all of that information. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll have more questions and lots more to think about as we make decisions that will incentivize, wise and thoughtful land use going forward. The next item on our agenda.
Madam Chair. Yep, we have a question.
Yes. Oh, yes, of course. Will we take questions now or at the end during the legislator session?
I think we had on the agenda the presentation and discussion of the presentation.
Got it, of course. Delegate Healy, kindly go ahead. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I just, I was going to wait for all of that, but there are some questions that this presentation raised, and I would like to just ask the presenter to comment on a couple things. You mentioned at the beginning, when you talked about getting information from various places, including the Maryland Department of Planning, and you said in the Washington metropolitan area, you also sought out some other organization. But I didn't hear you mention the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, which covers a very large part of Montgomery and Prince George's County, and really has a lot to information to impart about this.
Yes, I was referring specifically to the population projection data that we got from the Council of Governments and from the Department of Planning. We've also gotten protected lands data from Maryland DNR, and we've worked some with MDE, but the organization you mentioned, I'm aware of them, but we have not worked with them to gather data for this project as of yet.
I wonder if I would encourage you to include that, because it's a big swatch of land where it is a lot of development going on.
Mm-hmm.
It's really very impactful, and I think that it would, it skews all your information if that's not included. So that's number one. My other question, over the last several years, we have adopted policies in the state to reduce the development based on septic systems, and really want to encourage people to go into public sewer systems and to build up, and not to have more and more septic across the state. How is that reflected in because you mentioned some of things about septic as you went forward on your discussion.
Yes, we have, like in our zoning scenario where we use Maryland generalized zoning data. I mean, that helps some to kind of determine, where growth would occur and where it would not occur. And then for growth management, we actually could weight where we have sewer systems much higher than where we don't have sewer systems, to direct some of the future development, more of the future development onto sewer versus septic. And we have seen some interesting things as a result of those simulations. So for example, sometimes protecting forest land, if most forest land in an area, a smaller area, is also served by sewer, and you protect it from development, then you're deflecting growth away from sewer, right? So there's some complex interplay there in terms of what the land uses are currently and whether they're sewer or septic. But yeah, we do account for that, and we have a very detailed sewer map for the state of Maryland.
And the last question I have is about another policy that I didn't see you mention, which is really, maybe it's in the zoning section, about transit-oriented development, especially in the metropolitan areas, so that concentrating development around the transit hubs. Is that part of what you've been studying as well?
Well, it is. That would come under probably our infill and redevelopment. And like for the current zoning scenario, we actually solicited from the counties in Maryland if they thought their infill rates were not fairly reflected based on transit-oriented development in Montgomery County or other places. They were able to adjust those, and we incorporated that into that particular scenario.
Okay, let me ask you a specific Prince George's County question then, because there's a big transit-oriented development project along the Blue Line corridor, which Prince George's County is investing a lot of effort, money, and energy into making happen. Is that being weighed in your analysis as well?
I do not think it is, and when we update our forecast, we'll make sure that it is.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Delegate Healy. If there are any other questions, did I miss any hands? Thank you. I do have questions about smart growth, but we'll get there. In the interest of time, I think we'll move ahead. Senator Alfreth? So the next item on our agenda is the agency follow-up and discussion. We would love to hear from our agencies about how program open space and the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Program could be used to more effectively meet our tree canopy, land preservation, and related Chesapeake Bay conservation goals. We do have some time for this. And we have a PowerPoint, and I think DLS, the Department of Legislative Services, is up first.
Thank you, Madam Co-Chair. So Andrew Gray, Department of Legislative Services, requested to provide some information about the Trade Solutions Now Act of 2021. So a really brief presentation here. The overall goal of 5 million trees by 2031, the sustainable trees. Currently, around 470,000 trees have been planted. Of those, about 7% of the overall 4.5 million goal are in non-underserved areas. And then you have around 33,000 trees have been planted in underserved areas out of the goal of 500,000. So that's around 6.6% of the overall goal for that particular category. Overall, 9.4% of the 5 million tree goal has been achieved so far. In terms of the programs, largely the Department of Natural Resources programs have been funding that work, although you do see the Maryland Department of Agriculture programs are a component of that, and the Chesapeake Bay Trust as well, and then smaller components noted here for the other programs too. And then in terms of what this looks like by county, you see that Washington County, Carroll County, Garrett County, Frederick, and St. Mary's are kind of leading the charge in terms of the number of trees planted. And this is broken down also by the Department of Natural Resources with the orange bars here, and then once again the gray bars for the Maryland Department of Agriculture. And you can see the overall scope in terms of the county plantings. This baseline here of minus 87,000 means that there were trees that have been planted in particular jurisdictions, but they're not counted towards the 5 million tree goal because they were planted before a particular time period. I think it was 2019. So those were taken out of the baseline in order to true up the numbers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate that very efficient presentation. Obviously, we're still in the first few years of implementation of that bill. And so we're only going to see growth, pun intended, of that program. Delegate Stein, did I see your hand up?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. A question with respect to one of the incentives in the bill from 2021, and it increased the incentives for crop-related plantings. And I was wondering if there's any data so far as to whether that's been successful.
Delegate Stein, I would defer to the Department of Natural Resources and Maryland Department of Agriculture on that particular topic. They'll be presenting immediately after this.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, that is a prescient question, Delegate Stein, because the next part of the discussion is on forest buffers. And so, yes, we are going to be joined by both Department of Agriculture and Department of Natural Resources to talk about, this is a very specific goal within our Chesapeake Bay Agreement that, frankly, all Bay states are not meeting. And so that's why we wanted to kind of center it in today's discussion, and particularly how the two programs we are responsible for as a joint committee can be additive to that solution. And so I'm not sure between Secretary Addix and Secretary Kurtz, if you all agreed who would kick us off, but our two, I guess it is the Department of Agriculture to speak about MALF's relationship with forest buffers, and then over to DNR.
Thank you very much, Madam Co-Chair. Kevin Addix, Secretary of the Maryland Department of Agriculture. And I have the pleasure of introducing Michelle Cable, who's our Executive Director of the Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation, to walk you through this. And the rest of my team and I will be on here for questions.
Great. Thank you, Secretary. Michelle Cable, Director of the MALF Program, Maryland Agricultural Land Preservation Foundation. I just have a few slides. If you go to the next one, Andrew. So these are the two questions that were presented to us. Sorry for the formatting typo when we saved it as a PDF. They're both number one, so they're both very important. But the next slide, we'll start with the forest buffers information. But here's just a little background, just a reminder of the MALF program. We've been around since 1977. As of the end of FY23, over 350,000 acres have been protected through the MALF program. Next slide. and how our MALF and forestry and forested buffers, how do we work together? So for our MALF program, you go back to the legislative intent, we are here to protect the land for that long-term, perpetually available for agricultural lands, which includes forestry for food and fiber for the citizens of Maryland. We have, out of our 355,000 acres, almost 83,000 acres are in some type of forested or woodland, which is almost a quarter of all of our MALF easements. Out of our over 2,600 MALF easements, 2,300 of those properties have some forested lands accounted for them, whether it's a small area or the whole property could be forested. And if a MALF easement has 25 acres or more of contiguous woodlands, they are required to have forest stewardship plans. So we very much incorporate forests as one of the primary goals of protection for the MALF program. Next slide, please. So this kind of gives you a picture of a snapshot of a good farming and forested area, how there are patches. You have some obviously forested areas that are larger patches, some that show up as buffers in different areas. So when you look at the landscape, farming and the forestry are very much interrelated, intertwined. They make that quilt patchwork. Next slide, please. So through our property being preserved with the MALF program, what does that mean for buffers? So while our MALF easements do not have a specific affirmative obligation for buffers, what they do require are these voluntary conservation plans for the properties to become mandatory. And these conservation plans do require certain widths of setbacks from the different water courses and water bodies, require animals to be fenced out of streams. While they're not specifically required to have any type of buffer, forested buffer, vegetative buffer, the real benefit of having these plans becoming requirement is that for every single property we now have, there's a professional conservation resource staff person that goes out and gets boots on the land, walks the property, has a specific property plan based course of action and recommendations. And most importantly, there's that relationship that gets established with the conservation stewardship staff, the resource conservation staff, and the landowners. And they're able to provide them other options and avenues of other types of conservation practices for the properties, other types of potential cost sharing opportunities, could be wildlife related, could be water quality related. So it's that relationship that gets started that hopefully creates a much more well-managed property. And as I said previously, if a property does have more than 25 contiguous acres of forested land, the forest management plan is required on the property as well. Next slide, please. So this is the same map we showed you last month. The green areas are the MALF easements. The gray areas are all other types of protected lands. A lot of these are DNR lands, also county lands, but it shows really the patchwork of how there's a lot of land protected out there and they blend together, creating that patchwork of areas all over the state of protected lands. Next, please. So these were all of our MALF slides. Do you want to go back to DNR, or do you want us to jump to the high population part of the questions as well?
I would like to stick on trees if that's okay, and forest buffers. And then sorry to make us go back and forth, but I want to make sure we're and Delegate Stein, do you feel like your question was answered, or should Department of Ag?
I don't think so, and maybe it's just because there isn't enough data yet on the impact of the $1,000 one-time signing bonus for crep plantings under the bill. So, but that's okay.
Michelle, is that possible to get as a follow-up?
Sure, we can do that, and we can see how after DNR's presentation, and I know if Hans Schmidt, I don't know if he's still on the call, but if we don't have that opportunity to answer today, we'll absolutely have a follow-up.
Thank you. Okay, Department of Natural Resources. Let's talk trees.
All right. Andrew, if you could pull up the presentation, we're gonna have to skip to kind of towards the end for us to talk. Perfect. Wow. Fantastic work. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. For the record, I'm Josh Kurtz. I'm the Secretary of the Department of Natural Resources. Chair Elfreth, Chair Lewis, thank you for having me, and members of the committee. We're looking forward to talking about a wide range of ways that we're looking to meet our ambitious goals for a wide range of things, right? Not just land preservation, but clean water, clean air, and access to our natural resources. So just wanted to touch on healthy forests and really how we're thinking about that from a water and a carbon sequestration perspective. If you go to the next slide, please. I wanted to do that by highlighting a few of our most recent projects and really talking about how we're reevaluating our lands in the context of the 5 million tree plantings and really looking at what we're doing for buffers. So if you look at these two projects, one's at Browns Branch Wildlife Management Area and one's at Love Point, we ended up selecting these sites by evaluating water quality in the case of Love Point, which is on your right, and recognizing that we didn't have enough buffers to really protect and contribute to cleaner water. So we targeted tree plantings into Love Point State Park with the goal of buffer plantings for water quality. On the left side, you're going to see Browns Branch, and this is some maps that show you where the plantings go. And this is a little bit of a connection here to Caesar and really thinking about our living resources in our waterways. And so we ended up selecting this site for planting for dwarf wedge mussel protection. So just to give you an idea, when we're looking at our tree plantings and to meet the 5 million tree goals, how we're kind of increasing that or adding that qualitative lens. So we're working with our land managers across the state. We have a wide range of areas where we've identified targeted ecological areas, but we're going kind of beyond that, right? Where do we have areas that have degraded water quality? Where areas that have very good water quality, especially when we think about cold water streams, and then target kind of that qualitative component to the 5 million tree planting. So just wanted to kind of highlight two projects that shows some of a change in how we're thinking and change in how we're evaluating sites for the 5 million tree plantings. If you go to the next slide. And so forest buffers, obviously incredibly important for water quality and part of the Bay Agreement. And so we've been working on this, and I wanted to show you, there's a reason I picked this slide here. One, we're at 88% of buffers for forests and our forested wetlands on DNR lands. So above the goal, but we still have a long way to go, and it's something that we're prioritizing. The reason I wanted to highlight this slide is because you see in 2010 and 2011 a massive spike, right? Significant amount more planting, and that's directly related to having greater amounts of staff. And so we had the forest brigade at that time, and those people were just focused on planting buffers. So why is that important for us when we think about the next couple of years? Well, we've got the new governor's plan for the Department of Service and Civic Innovation. We're expanding our Maryland Conservation Corps. We're increasing our ability to plant within these areas. Our tree nursery increased their capacity by 3 million trees this year. And so we're looking to see much more of those greater spikes because we're pairing the number of trees, the analysis ahead of time to get clean water and better air outcomes for folks with greater capacity to plant. I think the other component that's really important and kind of gets to this forest buffer piece is building partnerships. As has been touched on, this program is fairly new, although we have had a really established planting program, but we're really leaning more on partners. And we're not just looking at these areas where we've kind of traditionally planted like buffers, but where can we do this in urban communities? We actually recently launched our classroom forest initiative, our schools forest initiative, which is going to be targeting or prioritizing schools where we can have the best water quality benefit, but also where there's a lack of tree canopy so we can get temperature benefits, et cetera. And also, frankly, have seen a really significant increase in the number of partners doing this work all across the state. So we're bullish on our ability to meet the forest goals because of the fact that we're aligning funding, we're prioritizing better, and we have a really strong community around us that's doing this work.
Delegate Lewis, would you mind if I editorialize just for a second on this issue?
I welcome editorializing.
Okay. Well, thank you to both teams. Appreciate the data. Secretary Kurtz, I think you had up there 88% of DNR lands are meeting your forest or have a degree of forest buffer. I'm not sure actually how we're going to measure that. Do you have a plan, appreciating you're going to bring in the new Department of Service, but how we get to 100% if that's possible, and what your timeline is for that?
Yeah, so the goal here is to align that with the 5 million tree solution. Obviously, we need to get there by 2025 for that buffer percentage. So we're keeping our foot down on the pedal there, still heavily prioritizing our buffers across our forest areas. The ability to get to 100% is frankly really tricky because a lot of the areas we have left are the ones that are hardest to access. So if you think about how we historically do plantings in buffers, it's bring in people, it's bring in not heavy machinery, but things like augers to do that work. So some of the areas we have left are some of our most difficult areas to plant. And frankly, it is going to take some innovation, a little bit of elbow grease, and thinking a little bit differently about how we do some of these plantings, because they will be slightly smaller scale because of the difficulty of location. So yeah, we picked all the low hanging fruit. There is none left, but we recognize that, and we're kind of reevaluating how we can deliver on that. And that does kind of come back to more bodies, frankly. More people hauling trees, more people doing the planting will allow us to be more successful in these areas that are difficult.
Thank you. And then my editorial here, just because I've also been working in my own district on the issue of how to get greater tree canopy on school property, because a lot of our schools just lack any shade whatsoever. Digging in a little bit again in my district, it seems that there's a little bit of self-negotiating within our school districts to leave large swaths of land under-treed or unforested, because there's a potential to need to use that land in 30 years to rebuild a school while having the current school still there. So, if you forest it, then you're gonna be hit with a payment in lieu, or a fee in lieu of losing that forest. So, just for other folks in your districts, just be cognizant that I think is a little bit of a factor for our school districts when thinking about adding tree canopy, and something we need to work around. Thank you for letting me editorialize, Delegate.
My pleasure. Actually, you've sparked me to editorialize, to circle back to Mr. Claggett and his land use modeling. And he talked about the 20% increase in population that Maryland will expect over the next couple decades, as I recall. 20% population decrease, so that will lead to increased housing demand, potentially increase commercial use. So what about the growth of schools? If our overall population is increasing by 20%, I'm assuming that there's some fraction of that population will be children in school, and wondering how the need to grow housing, schools, etc., affects the opportunities to forest school property. Actually, I'm just going to throw that out there. I don't expect you to answer that now, but it does come up for me in light of what we've heard so far this afternoon. Thank you. I think it's my turn to introduce the next presenter. So we'd like to hear from the Department of Natural Resources about the green and blue infrastructure on DNR-owned lands.
Great. Andrew, can you pull up that section? Thank you very much. So yeah, again, we wanted to use a couple specific examples to discuss green and blue infrastructure on state-owned lands, and specifically how we think about that in the context of acquisition and then long-term planning for those properties. And so you see on these maps are our targeted ecological areas. These are areas that are extremely significant for water quality, for habitat, for climate resilience, and for sequestration. So these are our targeted ecological areas. And so when we're doing analysis on how we're spending funding, whether that's acquisition, easements, we're looking to ensure that we're protecting properties that have these areas within them. What you also see then on the right is our blue infrastructure as well. So we're then evaluating, when we're protecting properties, how does that green infrastructure and blue infrastructure interact? How is those targeted ecological areas providing that protection to the waterways? You know, one of the things that we know is protecting a clean waterway is far more effective for having clean water in the future than trying to restore one. And at the same time, we also recognize that we have kind of had disconnections over time of many of our targeted ecological areas and the functions that they would play for our water quality. And I think this really brings in the idea of long-term restoration in terms of when we think about acquisition. So moving into the future and achieving the goals that we have set for ourselves for 40% is really precipitating us and kind of changing how we think about this. We are still protecting property that has high degree of targeted ecological areas, but what we're also really interested is what are the properties kind of within that would connect targeted ecological areas? What are the spaces that would connect green and blue infrastructure that maybe aren't there, but with protection and then restoration would allow us to reconnect those things. So when we look at our green and blue infrastructure maps, what we're actually trying to do is better align those when we're doing our protection and when we're doing the restoration work that could then come along with that. An area that I think we're excited about to have some additional growth is in the easement space. So we have 100,000 plus acres of land under easement across the state. Those are people that raised their hand and said, we want to help protect land in Maryland and we want to preserve our land for the use today. And so what we're looking at across the state is the interconnection spaces, right? How we then create corridors for our habitat for our native species. And those corridors, those connections create resilience, right? Cohesion of people and cohesion of ecosystems really contributes highly to resilience. So when we're thinking about green and blue infrastructure and we're prioritizing around it, think about how they're connected and ensuring that those connections persist and are restored long-term.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think it's in your court, Senator.
Thank you. We're getting to the meat of these issues. Really appreciate it. Delegate Stein.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, thanks for all your good work and your presentations. You, in talking about easements, picked up on your mention that establishing wildlife corridors as a benefit could be something that's part of an easement, or maybe a new form of an easement. So since, as you know, there's discussion about legislation that would enhance wildlife corridors, I just wanted to know if you could maybe amplify a little bit on what you said in connection with easements.
Sure. So when we think about easements and really all protected land, and when we think about habitat for wildlife, it's those connected corridors, and it's those connected corridors that allow for things, and especially in the face of climate change, it's not just about north-south migration anymore. It's upslope and downslope. It's understanding that as we see rising water levels, we're going to see communities migrate. And so ensuring that when we think about our easements, when we think about our protections, we're taking into consideration that opportunity for that migration when it comes to wildlife. One of many factors, obviously, but I think that the key piece overall is that connectivity, because that connectivity and that long-term preservation, large-scale ecosystems drive healthier ecosystems, frankly, when we protect and manage them properly. So really trying to marry the thought process around resilience, clean water, and habitat, and using some of the fine-scale data tools that we now have available to us, better understand what those ecosystems look like, how they function, and take that into consideration when we're doing protection and restoration. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Stein. Okay, we're going to keep it moving. Sticking with the Department of Natural Resources, our status in meeting Maryland's share of the Chesapeake Bay Agreement's public water access goal.
Absolutely. So we are on pace to meet Maryland's public water access goal. We have done, frankly, a fantastic job of that, especially compared to other jurisdictions. And we have a really important tool, and that's the Waterway Improvement Fund. This fund allows us to not only think about waterways from the context of lands that we own, but lands that others own as well, and ensuring that they're accessible. A big push for us over the past 10 months is reevaluating what those water access points look like and making sure that they're inclusive. We've installed several handicap accessible wheel or kayak launches. I think one thing that we're seeing is a huge increase in the passive waterway usage and in non-motorized vehicles. So thinking about how we can provide that opportunity for kayaks, for stand-up paddle boards. And when we look at our water access, I think one of the things that at the department, we kind of gives us a bit of an extra bit of responsibility is that we also manage the 16 state-owned lakes. So ensuring that when we're doing this work in our tidal waters, in the tributaries, and in the state lakes, we're thinking about this from ensuring that everyone can access the water. So that's not just the kayak launch itself, but it's the dock, it's the trail to the dock, it's the parking, it's the bathrooms. So we're kind of going back and looking at our access and making sure that while, we are, from a quantitative perspective, meeting our Bay goals, ensuring that qualitatively we're providing access to everyone, and also making sure when we look across the Bay, was touched on earlier, such a huge percentage of our waterways are privately owned. When we have opportunities to do acquisitions that give us access, we're prioritizing those, making sure that we're working with our partners, with our local governments. And I think local governments are incredibly important in this space as they're doing their long-term planning. Being on the same page about the opportunities for water access within the jurisdictions. And I think one thing that I can say with full certainty is that nothing makes people happier than water access at any of their parks. And so we're really committed to ensuring that we continue to stay ahead of the curve on meeting this goal. And we're doing it in a way that really promotes full access to these resources.
Thank you. Next, you're not off the hook yet, DNR. We'd like to hear more about, and then the Department of Agriculture as well. We call on you both to talk about the administration's plans for addressing areas of high population coupled with low preservation. So Department of Ag, if you'd like to go first, and then we'd like to hear from DNR on that. Thank you.
Sure. Andrew, could you jump down to page 66 of the slides? So I'll start talking before the slides come back on. So for the MALF program, how do we do our distribution for how it's decided for what gets protected across the state? We are statutorily, there's a formula for our funding that goes equally amongst all of the counties, and it is a voluntary program. So we need willing landowners to be able to protect more land for the agricultural easement side of things. With the distribution of the funds across all 23 counties, the way the formula works, there is what we call a general distribution, which is equal amongst the counties, no matter how many interested landowners that they have to apply for an easement. In those higher population counties, often that means greater development pressure, often that means higher land values. So even with an even distribution, they may not be able to protect as many properties with agricultural easements because the property is worth more and the easements cost more to acquire. And some of those higher population counties may only submit one or two, or sometimes they don't submit any applications in a given easement cycle. Our MALF program does not target landowners. There's always been a lot more interest than there has been availability of funds. And the counties, our county partners, are the ones that really work on the ground with the landowners to get the word out for the funding when the cycles are available for application. So per the way that our program works and the funding distribution, there is no active targeting possible to have more easements acquired in the more populated counties than other counties because of that even distribution. And there are just some pictures with that, but those are the words that were going to be on the presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Cable. And DNR next, would that be you, Mr. Secretary? Or sorry, is there a question?
Yes.
Yeah. Great, let's go ahead. If you would, Delegate Healy.
Still on mute, Delegate.
Sorry, I just said I could wait until the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Department of Natural Resources, can you talk with us about the high population and preservation conflict?
Absolutely. And I think this is something that was driven home even more acutely because of COVID, right? We saw some of our parks close to our urban centers get absolutely walloped. Or I guess you could say love to death. That's probably the politer way to say it. But it really did highlight, I think, the need for greater focus within and around our population centers. And I think, frankly, our biggest tool in the toolbox is the partnership with local governments around program Open Space Local. This program provides grants for acquisition for projects that increase our recreational opportunities in this space. It's also really directly tied to that long-term strategic planning that the counties do. So a lot of our counties right now are putting together their land preservation, parks, and recreation plans. These happen every 5 years. And so we're working really closely with our local governments, evaluating kind of where they have a dearth of public land. The thing about this program, though, is very driven by the decisions that are being made at the county level about development, frankly, about where they are trying to prioritize, grow their populations, grow their housing stock. And so what we've been working on is incorporating the need for public land with them through these plans. And I think, having such strong partners like Director Lays and her counterparts and the ability to work with the Parks and Recs directors through MACPRA has been really important for us. A really good opportunity to convene and really look to some of these. And recently, we've done some smaller scale acquisitions, and I really do think that that's going to be a big tool for us, right? It might not be a 10-acre park. It might be a 2-acre park. It might be a half-acre park. But looking at the population densities in those areas, I think really points to the need for some of these, quote unquote, smaller scale areas for people to recreate and enjoy the outdoors. So, for example, we just did a 2-acre acquisition in Hyattsville in partnership with local government, 0.2 acres in Silver Spring. And that really extends their Long Branch Park. That's something we've seen a lot from local governments recently. They're identifying parcels that are very small, but increase that continuity of green space. That's something that we really prioritize when we're looking at the state level in holdings directly adjacent property, because it helps them continue to manage the land. That can be a real hurdle, not only for us, but for local governments. When you set up a park 10 miles away from another park, now your staff has to drive that 10 miles multiple times a day. So again, working with them on their plans is really important. And then helping them build out some of their spaces, also important. So that's on the local side. I wanted to touch on 3 components that we're doing at the state. The first was mentioned earlier was the Green Space Equity Program. And I think this is going to be an incredibly effective program in that it's a grant program and is really going to be driven by partnerships. It's going to be driven by kind of, we learned this through the rural legacy approach, but it's a grassroots building kind of park building approach and really focusing in on areas that are historically underserved and overburdened. So we're in the process now of putting together the application itself, completing the mapping so that the potential partners, nonprofits, local government, et cetera, have a sense for where is eligible and then know what the process is going to look like. One thing that we've heard loud and clear at the department is that our application processes have to be tight. They have to be easy to understand so that we get even more people interested and applying for the project. So that's underway. Another piece of this for us is aligning our long-term planning with some of the local long-term planning and our ambitious, whether that's climate goals, water quality goals. And so we're in the process right now of the land preservation and recreation plan. This is our long-term strategy for stewardship, land preservation, outdoor recreation. We're actually contracting this out, so we're in the bidding process for that. The other piece is a tweak to program open space stateside. So, focusing on the targeted ecological areas has really been important for protecting the best of the best. But we've really looked at building in a kind of an equally weighted people focus component that looks at recreation opportunities, water access, access to areas that kind of have capacity pressures, a lower tree canopy, as Senator Elfreth touched on. We're looking at in-holdings, resilience, opportunities to protect our cultural and historic resources. Many people don't know this, but the department is the largest single owner of cultural and historic resources of any entity in the state of Maryland. And we really believe that's critically important and something that we're taking seriously and looking at in high population areas, right? Most of the cultural resources we've protected have been in rural areas. That's fantastic. But we need to be paying the same kind of attention to those opportunities within our more urbanized and densely populated areas. So that's just to give you a little bit of flavor of some of the ways that we're kind of reprioritizing, building in priority layers, being more long-term strategy focused, and then implementing some of the new legislatively mandated programs. And I would be remiss not to mention the partnership park, which I do think is something that we're starting to see really strong demand from some of our local partners, and we're currently working with them to kind of figure out what are the parameters. The difficult thing about a partnership park is the management structure itself. And I think that's what we're working to kind of develop criteria around. So any nonprofit, local government that wants to get involved, and we have heard from a lot of folks, which is a good thing, understands kind of how we would manage that. So those are a few, I guess maybe several of the things that we're doing right now to work on this issue in our high population centers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Senator.
No, thank you. I just want to say that this tension that Delegate Lewis mentioned between our population projections and the very reason we're all here today is going to only continue. And so it's something I just ask us all to really reflect on and think more creatively on. And I think both departments are doing that. So I just want to thank you. Delegate Healy, and then we're going to be a little bit behind in our schedule, but it's good that we've had this discussion throughout. So I hope that's also bought us back some time. Delegate Healy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I have my first question is about the MALF program and the whole issue of equity that we've seen, because if you have high population areas that don't qualify because they're in a large county with a lot of people, and they're basically in competition with a small county with few people, it doesn't see the equity issue of, if we vote one person, one vote, maybe our park should also be based on population. But that's just an editorial comment. My real question is about the other issue that comes up with, particularly in Prince George's County, where the agricultural area is largely not qualified because of the quality of the soil, and because the farms down there, which used to be tobacco farms, are mostly now horse farms and other kinds of farms, but they don't qualify for these easements, and so it's hard to preserve those properties. And it's a big piece of almost half our county. So I would like the department to kind of look at that issue. I know it's in the statute, but it might be time to look at that statute again to see where we can actually look at the overall arching goals of the state as far as preservation of land.
So, Delegate, I did actually follow up after our meeting in September and spoke with the Prince George's County staff specifically about the soils and eligibility aspect of it. And within our law, brought up some suggestions to them that they had not considered before to see if we can find ways to have more properties that are eligible. That they were going to look into. My biggest takeaway from the county staff in Prince George's County is they are having problems getting any volunteers, whether it's their county program or their state program. So even if we find ways for eligibility, we can't make them do it. So, but I did want to let you know that I did come up with some other suggestions of potential ways to be eligible, specifically in Prince George's County. It's something that we've worked with Anne Arundel County as well, and which they've been able to work out successfully. Still, they don't get a lot of high volume, but they're able to pick up some more properties for eligibility. So we'll see if we can make that avenue work for Prince George's County. And on your first comment about the equity among counties, the higher populated counties versus the lower populated counties, the equity, often the higher populated counties have better funding than the lower populated counties. So they often have abilities to contribute more funds to the matching program than say some of the lesser populated counties. So while we still can't buy as many easements with the same dollar, often those counties are able to contribute more funds to make their pot of the pie bigger for easements that we can acquire. But I'd be happy to follow up with either of those things with you if you want to talk in more detail.
Thank you very much. And I also, and I really appreciate that, especially the extra steps you took to reach out to Prince George's County. And I will follow up later at some point. I also wanted to ask Secretary Kurtz about whether you've been working with the Park and Planning Commission, Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. They own a lot of property too, that are historic and large areas where there could be a beneficial partnership if there isn't one there now.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And they actually serve as our main contacts for the counties that make up that the region. So we work very closely with them. And when we talk about the long-term strategy and figuring out kind of working with the counties, they're really the entity that drives that and works closely with us.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for all your presentations today.
Wonderful. Ms. Cable, could you make sure you get whatever you sent to Prince George's to Delegate Healy as well? Thank you very much. And actually just to our DLS staff so they have it on file, that would be wonderful. Okay, next is the elephant in the room, which is, do we have enough state staff to actually accomplish the goals that we've been discussing today? Now, we are a little bit behind, so I'm going to ask both secretaries to try to keep it together, teamwork under 5 minutes, so we leave room for discussion, if that's possible. Okay. Well, we'll go Department of Ag and then Department of Natural Resources.
Sure, and if Hans Schmidt is still on, he can fill in blanks here. With our programs, we have a mix of internal staff in our resource conservation. We have folks out in the field in some of the soil conservation districts throughout the state, and of course, we've got staff within MALF. Hans, anything you'd like to say about the staff situation?
No, a couple of years ago, I think it was 2018, we did an analysis once we had the WIP plan developed on how much staff we would need for the districts. And we would come back and there were 53 new staff that 50 went out to the districts and 3 went towards our verification team. So all field folks that where those folks went to. At this point, I think we're in pretty good shape as far as helping put that conservation on the ground. However, we are starting to develop more of these other programs, like the Small Urban Farm Program. We're also working very closely with NRCS. NRCS is bringing a number of staff on. Where we find a bottleneck in some cases is like a training coordinator to help bring on all these new staff, get them trained up. Folks that are getting certified to sign off on conservation plans, it takes over a year for them to get certified and so forth. When we're doing engineering reviews and so forth, we need to have someone with job authority to sign off on those plans to make sure that those practices are engineered towards the NRCS standards. And so that seems to be where our big bottlenecks are. So we're working very closely in trying to address those. But I mean, as far as the staffing, we're doing a lot of conservation planning. We're really building on that up and trying to streamline our program so that where we may have a bottleneck, if we can streamline our programs, we can get those services and get those practices out and implement it on the ground.
One thing I would add to that, within our department, we are a rather leanly staffed department, and I would say that I don't want to mention any of our other programs, but they look to Hans's shop at how it runs because of how well it is positioned as kind of the envy of our other programs. And as far as Michelle Cable and MALF goes, I know that it is a process to bring a property into preservation, and additional staff could always be helpful in doing that, just because it is a linear process and it takes a whole lot of time. And every time you add a property, that's another property you must inspect annually.
Appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. Secretary Kurtz?
Andrew, is it possible to pull up our two charts here? Because I think it's important to kind of get the context. Go down to the next one. Thank you. All right, so this is a kind of complicated chart. So I'm going to walk through the chart itself first. So what you're seeing on the left side, and this applies to the bars themselves, is total authorized number of pins. What you're seeing at the top, the trend line, is the total area, total acres of managed land by the state of Maryland. And so the light green area at the top is our Wildlife and Heritage Service. The brown in the middle is the Park Service, and the green at the bottom is the Forest Service. So what you're seeing is, as we have increased our land management, about a third of the lands that we manage, we have decreased our pins by about a third. That makes it very, very difficult for us to manage these lands for the many, many reasons that we have. One thing I also want to point out too is the Park Service makes up the large majority of the pins within our land management units, but each one of those units manages roughly the same amount of land. So when we think about opportunities to activate our wildlife management areas, when we think about opportunities to activate our forests, that is directly related to lack of staffing, right? I think right now we really focus on passive environmental passive recreation, natural resource use in those two, largely because we don't have the staff to do the intensive management that you see in the Park Service. If you'll scroll down to the next one, please, Andrew. Thank you. And so what you're seeing here is number of FTEs as it compares to visitorship. That trend line also being park acreage. So this is specifically for parks. That trend line shows the number of acreage of parks going up. The red bars show the total number of Park Service FTEs, or total number of pins, people that we have working in the parks. So 233 as of 2022. This is before the GMOA pins, everyone, just adds up. And then the yellow lines are the number of visitors in millions. So for every 17.5 million visitors to the parks, we have 233 staff. Now, not all of those staff are actually in the parks. Some of them are doing GIS work, interpretive work. And so what we've seen is, as our visitorship and our acreage has increased until GMOA, our FTEs have gone down, but GMOA doesn't even get us back up to our historic levels of the early 2000s. So one of the things we're looking at now, and I think was kind of just touched on, is decision-making. Is that based on acreage, or is it based on visitorship when we think about each one of our parks? And what we're seeing is that that's actually regionally specific. So in areas where we have very large swaths of land that might not get as many visitors, maybe we would think, okay, we can pull staff out of there. Well, the issue is we're managing that large swath of land as a healthy ecosystem. So we need to more aggressively manage that piece of property, that 2,500 acre forest. Whereas in other places where we have much more densely populated smaller parks, think maybe a Greenbrier, our limitation is staffing. So in terms of a metric for success, total number of FTEs to shoot for, or based on acreage or visitorship, what we're actually finding is that varies across the landscape. And we are doing that analysis internally to try to get a sense for, and it is being done by Department of Legislative Services through the contract as part of GMOA to get a sense for what an ideal number is. But I will say, adding 10% more of the state lands into this mix without increasing our staff is going to make for not a well-managed service and a well-managed system. Right now, we have one of the best in the country, and I think we're going to continue to do that. But this does provide a significant challenge for us in terms of continuing to acquire land at the rate we need to meet the 2040 goal.
Thank you to both secretaries, and I'm sure we're going to continue this conversation when we have our budget hearings in February.
I think the next item, Senator, is the Department of Legislative Services. Andrew Gray, if you would bring us up to speed on your views on staffing.
Madam Co-Chair, I think we've actually finished the formal agenda. So the Department of Legislative Services did present on the Tree Solutions Now Act. And so
that's it. Okay.
I think you are now in the discussion period of the agenda. And I would like to thank Dara Moriarty for kicking in there while I lost power.
Thank you. So with that, we'll move on to the discussion period. As Andrew was just saying, Senator Alfreth, that's where we're at on our agenda. We'd like to talk about potential legislation and budget priorities to consider. And this is a great place for legislators to weigh in. I guess it'll be a facilitated discussion. We'll invite comments, thoughts, but I think this is a safe space for brainstorming. I'm almost tempted to call on Delegate Healy because she's been full of great questions all along, but her camera's off. So perhaps Senator Alfreth, since you're on a budget committee.
Thank you, Delegate. So I do think we're going to have some difficult conversations ahead altogether about the staffing issues, particularly as we're expanding public land access to public land. We're going to also, as both secretaries discussed, we need to expand our ability to steward that land properly and ensure safe access to that land. So definitely going to be a focus of our budget hearings. I can't speak for the House, but certainly in the Senate moving forward. I will add that I am working on a piece of legislation not related to POS or MALF, but another very lovable acronym, which is Waterway Improvement Fund. And Secretary Kurtz alluded to this a little bit, but in similar kind of line of thinking, how do we maximize that program to ensure greater ecological outcomes, in this case, restoration of wetlands, but also public benefit, the public water access. And so that is a piece of legislation I plan to bring to the Senate, and happy to discuss with any colleagues offline.
Any other legislators would like to weigh in? There are a bunch of senators on this call. Delegate Healy?
Well, I just thank you very much. I was all there all along. I just turned my camera off for a few minutes.
Okay.
Really, I've always been of the view that we don't necessarily need legislation to get things done. And I think I really appreciate being part of this discussion today, because it's really focusing on what the administration is doing. And some of it is to repair problems that have come by in the past through recessions and COVID and all the things and the lack of staffing, all the things that we've had to deal with in recent years. And the fact that they're focused and they're ramping up to do the job is really impressive to me. I know on our committee, I was somewhat appalled at one point during COVID when the parks were being just completely, the only place people could go to be outside was to be outside, so that they would be able to keep social distance and still have some kind of recreation, was to go to the parks. And the parks were overwhelmed with people. And we had a meeting in my committee where there was discussion about how in some of the parks, they didn't have anybody. They were using volunteers to staff, and there were no park rangers. There was nobody there. And people stepped up, the public stepped up to do this. And I as a volunteer, I hope that never happens again. I think it's wonderful that we have great people in our state that are willing to do that. But that is the responsibility of the government. And I just want to say that I am supportive of it, making sure that these departments have adequate staff to do the jobs that we've given them to do. And I'm not contemplating any particular legislation, but I will look forward to what colleagues have to offer.
Thank you, Delegate.
Senator Gallion, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Just a couple points or things to bring up after being on here. I'm glad they highlighted the staffing issues, and I'd be curious to see how that looks after the full implementation of the Great Outdoors Act, where we added in legislation that probably pretty much I think all of us voted for. So after that's all added in, will that get us kind of in the neighborhood of where they need to be? That might be more of a question than a legislative thought. But I'm hoping that will help that situation greatly. And the only other point I wanted to bring up, and this is really probably more towards Michelle there at Mouth. So I'm not as familiar with that program as I am like the local Harford County program, but what we found there with Bill Amos from our planning and zoning in Harford County, in areas that have a lot of heavy development pressure, especially the ones surrounding what in Harford County we call our development envelope, which is the areas on the Route 40 corridor up into Bel Air and that area that have water and sewer. They started doing bonuses for a lot of these payments for ag preservation. So if you're, with the grading and whatnot, if you're in an area that is going to have heavy development pressure, you get, in certain areas you get more money for signing on, which has helped. And we've, that program, they've really been pressing that. So I'm not as familiar with Mouth, if that's something that they have like bonuses for areas that have really high development pressure, but it seems like that's working pretty well in Harford.
So Mouth does not have a bonus, sign-on bonus like the Harford County example that you gave, but we do have the opportunity, if it's something that the counties want to add to it, they can always kick in a bonus on top of what the Mouth payment is. So that can be something that I'm actually trying to have a state, like a county-wide, together with all of the counties again, talk about all different types of things. So that could be something I can learn more from Bill Amos with Harford County to see if any other counties want to try to apply that to combine with Mouth with state and county funding. We are legislatively unable per our statute. We can't purchase easements in areas that is the growth area. So we have to stay outside of where a county wants to growth, but often that's right along the edge, like to kind of create that green line. So the growth doesn't keep sprawling. So that could be an opportunity there.
Right. I appreciate that response. And, same, like you mentioned, it couldn't be actually in like a development envelope, but it's the surrounding areas that are getting that high amount of pressure. So thank you for that.
No, thank you.
We have just 2 minutes left. I know we're all tightly booked these days. And if DNR could get Senator Gallion just a direct response to the question about staffing. I know,
Yep.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, happy to. So Senator Gallion, the approach that we're taking with the 75 pins, we're trying to do basically two things. We're looking at where we could do kind of more centralized kind of coordination across parks. So instead of saying, okay, we need one GIS person in every park to make the trail map, we hire one GIS person to do trail maps and planning, things like that. So we're trying to spread out kind of centralized or regional approaches to build capacity. And then in the parks that are really in need of more bodies on the ground, that's where we're going to prioritize putting those some more rangers, some more maintenance staff. So that's kind of the two ways we're evaluating the park system. The DLS report is also kind of looking at the scale of our park system for visitorship and acreage and going to give us an estimate on those parks numbers. I just want to point out though that while this is incredibly helpful for our park system, these positions are not going to the wildlife management areas or the Forest Service, which already have a much smaller number of pins. So that's another area we're looking at. Are there opportunities for us to co-manage with the Park Service as they really get some additional staff and centralized capacity to ensure that we're managing all of our lands effectively?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate that.
I think, thanks, Senator Gallion, for your questions, and thanks to all of our agency folks. Senator Elfreth, we're counting down the last 60 seconds here. Would you like to wind up?
Sure. Well, I just want to I think we, just for the 2 meetings we've had, we've gotten a tremendous amount of work done. And I think more importantly, set the stage for the joint work that this joint committee would like to engage in with Governor Moore and the administration and the secretaries here. And I think you're all sensing where we are going and the questions we are asking and the goals we are focused on achieving together. And so I expect that this is going to these two meetings have just been the beginning of the conversation that will continue through the legislative session. So I just want to thank everybody, particularly the DLS staff and particularly the MDA, MDP, and DNR staff who contributed to making these two joint committee hearings so successful.
Thank you. And to our community speaker, Diana Conway, who came in to lift us all up, lift up our awareness about the issues with artificial turf as well. So thank you. This has been great. We've got a lot of work to do. We look forward to doing it together.
Thank you all.
With that, we're adjourned. Bye-bye.
Thank you.